It's almost 11 o'clock, and I thought we'd talk about a couple things. First of all, we're not going to have a meeting next week for several reasons. Josh and Janice are celebrating, as I hope most of you are, the Memorial Day. Is that what it is? Holiday?
Yeah.
And I'm just flat exhausted, so the idea of preparing for another meeting next week, I don't know how teachers do it. You prepare in advance. There are openings available now, highly paid and richly rewarded in other ways, for an administrative assistant to help keep email lists together so that all of you receive the information. Applicants can simply send me an email, and I'll then describe the basic salary and benefits that go with this job. It'll be about twice what I'm being paid, so it's a really
You're very generous.
a good thing. As I was working on this topic this morning, I reflected on what we've been doing over the last several months. I joked a little bit about how a topic that probably would interest many of you would be traffic on A1A. If you think about the topics we have discussed, we've certainly tackled the big ones, from race in the United States and in our lives, diversity, our voting system, homelessness. Israel and the problems there have been large topics for us for many years. And in the last 11 days, as you all know, they've risen again clearly to qualify as current events. Last night, as I think most of you know, a ceasefire was agreed. Most people think it won't last long. In the 2004 war, they call it, there were 11 truces before they finally stopped shooting. So expect this ceasefire to last briefly. In these 11 days, as this slide shows, there have been 230 deaths in Gaza, primarily from Israeli airstrikes. It was mostly an airstrike battle from Israel's side. 12 residents died in Israel. I wanted to put this in context, though, because it's a major topic, and people all over the world or in many places in the world are excited about it and talking about it. Yesterday, or the day before yesterday, 675 people died right here from COVID. And yesterday it was 652 or something, where our average this week will come down to about 650. 587,000 since this pandemic began. I say that only to emphasize the importance of talking about things that really matter and putting in context those that are important to discuss and know about. But let's remember that it's not as though the world ended. And I'm going to come back to that relative level of pain as I discuss the 3 or 4 alternatives where we go next. So today, I'm going to briefly describe the issues, then a little background and history. I sent out an earlier version of this slide deck, so you know that there are some maps coming, and they talk about the historical progression of what we now call Israel and its territories. Constraints for where we go and how we solve the problem. Demography has often been one of the big threats for Israel. Yasser Arafat always used to say, "Don't worry too much about the battlefield, we'll win at the cradle," I think was what he called it. And if any of you remember the better word, his idea was our birth rate, at that time, Palestinian birth rate was 12.1 births per capita. At 2.1, populations maintain a steady level. Europe is now at 1.6. We're dropping now for the first time in a long time. 12 deaths per capita. That's rapid growth. And the comparable figure for Jews in Israel was about 2. So Arafat said, just wait, one of these days we'll so outnumber the Jews that it won't matter. So demography is important, both in terms of birth rates and where people live. Democracy, whether or not people are really free to vote or play any part in their government, we'll come back to that. A major issue that has to be addressed and isn't being addressed very well, not just in Israel, elsewhere, in a truly booming economy. It's the best economy in the Middle East by far. There is still abject poverty. Now, it's concentrated in the West Bank, Gaza, and the East Jerusalem slums, and has something to do with Israel-Arab politics. And of course, the question of how much international aid from the United States, the European Union, most funneled through the United Nations. But the level of that aid in a changing world is an important constraint. We're going to look at 3 options for where to go next, from the 2-state solution, which has long been the favored solution since the Oslo Accords, to full democracy, where we literally collapse the various boundaries, West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Golan Heights have already been more or less brought in. And everybody is a citizen, everybody has a vote. And there is no longer a state religion. Jews can celebrate Judaism, and Muslims can celebrate Islam, but there's no state religion. Or we can just maintain the status quo. The issues, the current ceasefire, we now know that that's done, but again, it's continue to watch this space, as they say. At the time when I put this together, I was still in the mood, and this is how rapidly the knowledge of the area and understanding of what's possible changes. I still thought just 6 days ago that a 2-state solution made sense. Let's go back a little bit to the beginning, and I know that there's an earlier history, but the history I wanted to talk about here is when did this concept of a Palestine separated into Jewish and Palestinian areas first began? It was the end of World War II and the British mandate for the area. As you all probably know, the British governed all of what was then Transjordan. And after the war, as they were beginning to leave or abandon or give up colonies everywhere, this was part of that effort. And in respect to Palestine, of course, Jordan became Jordan. That part of Syria the Brits had became Syria. Palestine was separated then into 2 states. The same concept that we've been talking about unsuccessfully kind of ever since then. They were not independent. Some were managed by Egypt, some by Jordan, some portions of the country. But the goal was to eventually transfer power to those separate areas. The group that disliked this the most were the Zionists. They were coming from Europe. They were some of the greatest heroes. The stories of how they fought to get to Israel and make it into Israel are legend. And the war that they fought, by the way, included the opposition, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, and even forces from Iraq were fighting those Jews who were seeking to establish a homeland. And the Jews won. After the armistice, the first step was to move Palestinians out of areas where the Jews wanted to live. 700,000 Palestinians fled to 68 different refugee camps, many of them located in the countries surrounding Israel. The first camps I visited were in Jordan, the second in Lebanon, And the extraordinary thing to me was it seemed like I was in the same place. They all seemed to feel and look the same, the camps. And this was long before, this is the first time 30 years ago, and the second time 20 years ago, still in many parts tent structures, not the buildings that we see today. As of today, 5.6 million Palestinians are registered as refugees. That's an extraordinary number. And part of the problem, some people say, is they won't give up being Palestinian. Refugees from all sorts of countries come to the United States, and within a generation or two, they've given up their earlier identity and become, everyone in this room, I assume, is either a descendant of a refugee, or there might be one or two of you refugees. And we're no longer Germans or Dutch or French or whatever. I'll intersperse this with just pictures of the camps. Between 1948 and 1967, the countries surrounding Israel continued to threaten its existence and demand that it no longer exist, but it was relatively quiet. Then in 1967, that sometimes called the Six-Day War, sometimes the Yom Kippur War. Was Yom Kippur 2004?
It's not the 1967, it's a different war.
It was a different war, yes. The Six-Day is...
That's one war, and then there's 1970...
Yeah, Yom Kippur followed a few years after the 67 war. It was an extraordinary victory for Israel. In 6 days, they took the Sinai, all of the areas that are contested here. The Shatila camp outside Beirut is one of those that I visited. I'll come back to that later. Today, more or less, this is the story. Golan Heights, and when we talk about the Golan Heights, we're no longer talking about Palestinians. There are Arabs there, but they're Druze, they're not Palestinian. And the issues of Palestine and all the things we talk about in regard to the West Bank and Gaza are really quite separate from the issues of Golan Heights. Trump declared that Golan Heights was now part of Israel, and for all intents and purposes, that's true. I don't know if the Syrians have completely accepted that, but the issues are radically different from those having to do with the Palestinians. Then the occupied West Bank and Gaza. The key word here is occupied. The life in the West Bank, and they're a little bit different since 2006 when Hamas won the election. Life in the West Bank is literally life as it was in occupied Germany France by the Germans, and Germany by the Americans and the Russians and the French. Meaning checkpoints at every corner, regulated movement of everyone, regulated in and out of parts of the community, certainly in and out of the West Bank. And that movement occurs when people go to work. A camp outside the town of Tibaya, called Tibaya Camp. And you'll see that these structures now, there are actual buildings as opposed to the tents that existed for decades after 1948. But they're packed in sheet by jowl, and the conditions are not what most of us would accept. The PLO first took authority under Yasser Arafat, was recognized as the authority by the UN, not accepted by Israel. After the Oslo Accords in '93, and it's in Oslo that we came up with a two-state solution that's been the discussion for most of the last 20 years. Arafat led through 2004 and managed to govern both Gaza and the West Bank simultaneously. It was a PLO, PLA, Palestine Authority. Anyway. Then in 2006, with Hamas's victory, it all breaks down. Hamas now governs in that. Another camp outside Ramallah. This is a camp in the southern part of Gaza, and we'll show you where that is in just a second. Israeli settlements began almost as soon as the conservative government, the Likud, took power. And these were efforts that, as you all know, continue this day, of Israeli Jews to move into West Bank or East Jerusalem areas. There haven't been any in Gaza. There were some, though, before the military left. It's primarily West Bank and East Jerusalem, and simply build housing, build communities. And some of those communities are as wealthy and well organized as Israel proper, with schools and parks and playgrounds and all kinds of security around them. And what happens is that one family or one group of family moves in and others are added. Have any of you had any experience with settlements, been to Israel since the settlements began? Ken, did you have an opportunity to visit or talk to any of the settlement or settlers?
No, but you could tell they were different by the roof. The roof would identify an Israeli house.
As opposed to the Palestinian things. Jenny, were you there? Jenny sent a very full and interesting description of her experiences in Israel. She's been 11 times. Were you there since the camp started, since Bibi's been prime minister? We need a mic. If somebody can get her a mic. Thanks.
Oh, you've got like.
I have not been there since 2011.
Well, that's fairly recent, frankly. Did you have an opportunity to go into
In the West Bank.
West Bank? That's where some of
The wall was there surrounding the West Bank. We were going to Bethlehem, and one of the things we were told was since that wall went up, there was a lot less of artillery fire coming from West Bank into Israel. The wall had sort of, even though it didn't appear to be that high, it had somehow helped that situation. But when we went there, we had a driver from our hotel take us to the border, and he was a Jewish person. And he had arranged for us to meet his friend, who was an Arab who lived in Bethlehem. And he met us at the border. And the two men stood there hugging each other and asking about their families because they had been good friends and no longer could get together. And then we were with this guy from Bethlehem, and his main mission was to get out of there. And he couldn't get out of the West Bank. He wanted to take his family and leave, and he couldn't.
Leave to go to Israel proper, or leave the area completely?
Leave the area completely. Yes. And he told a sad story of how all they wanted was peace.
Yeah.
And to live with the Jewish people in peace.
I wonder if he had any experience living in a camp, or did he have a home and just live in an ordinary home in the West?
No, I didn't live in any of the camps. I visited two of them. The one in Jordan, which is pretty civilized camp, the way it is set up. I mean, they have their shopping malls, they have everything in that camp. And I did the one in Lebanon.
Shazil, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. The settlements, Bob?
I'm the runner today.
One of the things to keep in mind when we're talking about Israeli.
Somebody, the mic is on.
It's on. Hold it closer to your mouth.
Is better?
Yeah.
Okay. If you take a look at where the new that's where they put their new development. And that is a major, major intention by the old Palestinians, because that just takes their best land where they could grow crops and so. And I saw this probably 15 years ago, but it still continues that very same way. So
Yes.
and within the last year, they're starting a new development. I haven't checked it, but I'll bet you it's a very good.
Close to good one. And you got to believe the Palestinians are living in the best place they could find, and therefore Israeli settlers or Jewish settlers who want to come in and take land will probably come out of place. What's written here is quite important to observe. You take the settlements plus illegal outposts plus the off-limits areas for security reasons, which is part of the reasons that the shelling stopped. 60% of the West Bank is already in Jewish hands. That's amazing to me. And a new settlement is inaugurated almost every day. This is a very contentious issue, and part of the issue has to do with this concept of right of return, and we'll come back to that. The recent violence began in part because of this place called Sheikh Jarrah, and don't hold me to the pronunciation of that. I want to say only 6 or 7 houses were involved, for those who've been reading about that. But the Palestinians had asked the International Court to deny these 6 or 7 houses the right to be there, saying they took our land illegally and they have to give it back. And the International Court said, yes, you're right. A ruling or an acceptance of that decision was pending just, I want to say, hours before this recent crisis began. The idea of Palestinians going to somebody, some authority, and saying, we want our homes back, we want our land back, it makes sense. It's interesting that they'd even try, but it's not a surprise to me that the Israelis would not accept that. The Gaza Strip's a different story altogether. Of course, Hamas is a terrorist organization. We don't recognize it. Even in these last several days, when Biden calls to talk to someone, he talks to Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PLA, and he's up in the West Bank. Sadly, doesn't have any authority over Gaza, and yet it's Gaza that is shelling Jerusalem, not the West Bank. 2 million people squeezed into this little tiny piece of land. Over the course of these 11 days, their one power plant, and the only reason I knew anything about this is that bids were solicited from the international power industry to come build an additional power plant in Gaza. We declined it, even offered, because the risks were so high and impossible to insure anybody doing work there. That plant is important because it provides electricity, but it also is important because that electricity keeps the pumps running to supply water. It goes back to Bob's comment about the importance of water in this arid part of the world. The fuel for those pumps, those that are diesel-fired pumps, comes from Israel. One of the camps that I had a picture of was Rafah, or maybe it's coming up next, I think I showed it earlier. It's down at the very tip, you'll see it at the bottom there, against the Egyptian border. Living there is almost the mandate for life in Gaza is to be a revolutionary, to hate and to want to fight and to resent even your very existence. Just imagine being there and not participating in some kind of revolutionary activity. East Jerusalem is the third area, part of the West Bank, so it's often considered part of that. But East Jerusalem is the site of the Holy Land. It's where we all go when we visit the religious locations. It was originally occupied by Jordan, whereas the West Jerusalem was occupied by, occupied by Egypt. Is that right? Building permits in East Jerusalem are going almost exclusively to Jews, as you can see. This is the area, and if any of you visited Jerusalem, it's that tiny, if you look at the bottom, the left-hand map, it's that tiny area there where we typically would go. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is located there. Al-Aqsa Mosque was important in this latest outbreak. And all those pink dots up in this area to the right are areas where Israeli settlements, I think that's what it is. No. The blue triangles are Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem. The pink areas are Palestinian neighborhoods. One of the articles I sent to you, if you had a chance to read it, was by Anthony Cordesman. He speaks frequently at the Council on Foreign Relations. He teaches at SAIS from Johns Hopkins. He talks about that it's not 2 states in Israel, it's 5 failed states. Israel, dynamic economy, extraordinary success from that standpoint, and its very existence all these years after, fails not because it's ungovernable, but because it has not yet dealt with the Palestinians. And it's not stable in the sense of a successful governed state, and won't be until it deals with the Palestinians. The West Bank, of course, has failed because it's a state. Mahmoud Abbas is 85 years old. His term expired in 2004. And he just keeps, as so many leaders do, keeps rolling it on forward and forward. You can't call that a successful state. But beyond that, it's a poor area of the economy of which it can't work because it's occupied by the military. I mean, it's a tragedy. Gaza, of course, 43% unemployment, $5 a day is the living. We call abject poverty anything around $2 a day. They're just above that. And then Cordesman defines 2 other, quote, failed states. And he said they're not bodies of land, but he says the Israeli Palestinians are a state wherever they live, and a failed state. Many have moved to, and most in the region have moved to refugee camps and just won't assimilate into Jordan or Lebanon or Egypt or Syria. They continue to maintain and foment more and more hatred. Part of me says I can't blame them because it's poverty and it's awful, but part of me says, for heaven's sakes, it's never going to change if you don't change. And finally, the religions. Whether it's Christians, Jews, or Muslims, we've failed to come to terms with and reconcile. It's an interesting article. The demography. 9 million people live in, 9.2 million live in Israel. 20% are non-voting Palestinians, and that's really important to focus on. The fertility rate has changed. It's now equal. The demographic crisis, that old Yasser Arafat thing, is we have more babies, someday we'll take over. It's similar to the Mexicans that we talk about in the southwest of this country. Their birth rate is such that eventually the demography will mean that it'll be a more Mexican area. Well, 3.1 births on both sides now. Jewish parts of Israel and Palestinian parts of Israel are growing the same. So for all intents and purposes, we can take that off the table. It's significant, those numbers at the very bottom, 475,000 Jews in the West Bank. Those are all illegal settlers. 250 illegal settlers in East Jerusalem. That means to me, we're never going to go to a two-state solution. It's just impossible today. Democracy. Palestinians who remained in Israel after the 1948 war have citizenship, and can vote in both national and local elections. They have political parties. Those parties haven't had any seats in Knesset to date, but they have parties, they do vote. They're discouraged. Palestinians from Jerusalem are considered, this is East Jerusalem, permanent residents. They can vote in East Jerusalem elections, but not national elections. And that's that whole section where the holy sites were. Palestinians who are resident in the occupied territories, West Bank, Gaza, are not allowed to vote at all in Israeli elections. They do participate in Palestinian Authority elections, but it has limited governmental authority. Now let's talk about the biggest issue of all, I think, and that's the right of return. If you're dispossessed or displaced during the Nakba, and the Nakba is how the Palestinians refer to the 1948 war, or catastrophe, or disaster. You've been forced out of your home. And as I mentioned earlier, that's some 700,000 right after the 1948, and several hundred thousand more since that time. You think, I have a right to go back. A right of return is one of the concepts that we learned first about Jews and Germany, and the right to go back to Germany after World War II. International law is very clear on this subject. If you're dispossessed or displaced by an illegal act or an act of violence, you have a right to go back. And if going back means it's impossible physically, you get reparations. And the international courts have supported this over and over and over again. So that right is universally recognized, except when it applies to Palestinians and Israel. And one of the problems is, and it's the same problem we have here in this country. People say, well, I have something because my ancestors were slaves. And some of us will say, yeah, but you're not a slave, and you've never been a slave, because your great-great-great-great-grandfather. Well, in many cases, descendants of refugees are now bringing cases, not the refugees, because the refugees are their grandparents who are now dead. The law is settled on that. Descendants of refugees have the right to return. But just imagine, I hope you're all seeing the comparison between right to return and reparations in Israel and reparations for slavery in the United States. It's a tough question. International aid to Palestine, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency is the major conduit for funds that governments, the United States, the European Union, and others give to Israel to support Palestinians and their problems. There are also direct support. Somebody was saying earlier that a single donor from the United States, Sheila, paid for the movement of the capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Private donors are legion. One of the ways that people here in the United States, Jews in the United States, can honor their return to Zion is to support financially Israel in all of its causes. From 2006 until the present time, there's been no money going to Hamas. Hamas, from us, though Hamas is well supported by Iran or Saudi?
Iran.
Hezbollah is supported by
Both of them.
by both of them.
Hezbollah and Hamas.
Hamas would be then Sunni, like all of Gaza, and Hezbollah Shia, if it's supported by the Iranians. It's odd for me to think of Iran supporting a Sunni terrorist group.
Yeah. Most Yemeni are Sunni.
Most Yemeni. Yeah, we're talking about Gaza. The Palestinians in Gaza are all Sunni. Yeah, they're Sunni.
Okay, but when you're talking about Hezbollah, they're the ones in Yemen financing the Houthi.
The Houthi, though, are
The Houthi are financed indirectly by Iran and directly Hezbollah is funded by Iran, and they are funding the Houthi.
Okay. Well, in the case of Hamas, my point is they're not getting UN money. They're not getting money from the United States. And that we need to keep that in mind when we think about our support for Gaza. I think Biden just agreed to several $100 million to go to Gaza for rebuilding some of the damage. That says it right there, $235 million. But it'll go through the United Nations. Now let's look at the solutions quickly, and then I'm going to stop talking. The two-state solution was really originated a long time ago. As I say, in 1948 there were two states. The Oslo Accords say, let's go back to that and let's give real government with real rights of statehood to the residents of the West Bank and Gaza, just as the residents of the rest of Israel have those rights and a real democracy. 165-6 in the United Nations, with unfortunately Israel and the United States abstaining. Nonetheless, the popularity of this two-state solution is extraordinary. Everyone seems to agree, or seemed to agree, that was the obvious answer. Increasingly, it's looking like it's just an impossible answer. This is beginning to be, at least for me, the only way out. Combine West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights with the rest of Israel. Everyone is a citizen except for known terrorists and criminals. One person, one vote. No state religion. And a full right of return. Does that sound impossible?
Yes,
Totally.
that's a dream.
Is the tough part of it the right of return?
Impossible.
And so then you go to this. Now, I want to remind you of that first slide. In the disastrous 11 days, 12 Israelis died. Many Israelis went to restaurants, went to the beach, and they did so because of that Iron Dome, which keeps the missiles from landing in Israel. To me, accepting the status quo doesn't work. And so if it's not one of the other two states or a single democratic state, what is it? Do we accept the status quo? Which means periodically there'll be some shelling and periodically there'll be some airstrikes. And Palestinians, between those periodic events, live in poverty and without a vote. And that's where I'm going to stop comments. Which of those three, or if you have a fourth, you're welcome to throw it out. Which of those three futures makes most sense? Forrest?
I love you. I love your preparation.
Just a second. And you've got to say that again because it's so important.
Stay down here.
Sal?
Sal,
Sorry? Okay.
stay down here. I'll take the rest.
I'm the
I
pest.
moved too far away from you. That
I'm
was
the
not a
pest.
wise decision.
Bob, I love you. I love your preparation time, but your bias is unbelievable. I mean, you got 38 minutes, and now we can discuss it for 22. So I think the thing that you're trying to propose there, almost every slide you had basically favored the Palestinians, and the Israelis are like the bad guys. The Israelis have a right to exist, which the Palestinians have never recognized. Nobody else but the Palestinians, in my opinion, think the Israelis have no right to exist. And the idea of being in a war with the Israelis, from the Palestinian standpoint, most anybody in that region, it's like, you just brain dead. I mean, the Iron Dome is one of the great defense systems on Earth.
Yeah.
And it's 235 or 12 losses for the Israelis. I mean, you lose in 20-1. Sometimes you gotta look in the mirror and say, I think it's us. I think the Palestinians have this horrible leadership, as you said, they haven't been elected since '04. And to say to Israel, which is a prosperous state of its own, that you can't expand and grow, it's like, get over it. We're growing, and we're gonna make something happen here. And if you want to play fairly and honestly, you might be a party to it. But the idea of living in those slums, to me, it's like, that's their problem. They ain't done anything to fix it either.
Well, first let me say, if I've been overly biased, I'm sorry, because I've tried so hard to, on this topic and others to find a middle road. The problem, I totally agree that I've not talked as much about right to exist as right to return. Right to exist is powerful, and to me it dominates. Sally and Charlie has something, and then, Caroline first.
Just wanted to know, I think you've done a magnificent job, thank you. For the first time, I think I understand what's going on there. But where would the second state, where would the Palestinian state actually be if there were two states?
Well, that's the perennial problem. Where would that black state be when all the American blacks are moved back to Africa, which some people want to do? And whose property are we going to take for that? It has to almost be the existing West Bank and Gaza. But how do you do that if
They're so
60%
far
of the
apart.
West Bank is now occupied by Israelis? I don't know. I think that's one of the reasons I think two states is hard to imagine.
Yeah.
And the problem with it, go back to what Forrest was saying, the problem with two states is that what it requires is decent leadership in the Palestinian states, and they don't have it. Yasser Arafat wasn't able to, you couldn't talk to him, and Mahmoud Abbas, who looked so good, we all looked a lot better 40 years ago. And even then, he didn't have much authority. So, Charlie?
Yeah, just a couple of things here. Talk about right of return. Kind of got to look back a little further than 1948, maybe about 3,000 years.
I think we're going to go there.
Yeah, go there, and if you read that with the Romans and the Jews were there, and then they dispersed and talk about the right of returning, which then became the right to return when Israel was recognized in 1948.
Absolutely.
As far as leadership, I agree that Arafat was one of the big problems. I mean, the Camp David Accord, they all agreed on it, Egypt, United States, and even Arafat said, yeah, that makes sense, and then when it came time to sign the paper, he walked out. So he had the opportunity for the two-state, and he turned it down. As far as your point about everybody living together and all being equal, I go back to Arafat again, which you said, what was the term you said, that we don't have to have war, it'll be the cradle, or something you said?
He said, we'll win at the cradle. We'll win.
Yeah, the birth
He may have said, we'll win in the better. The idea birth rate.
Yeah, and that's the big issue. It will be the birth rate, because eventually, if you have enough people thinking one way, and they're never going to all think the same way, and that's a dream. But eventually, you will have a larger group, and the larger group, most of the time, will prevail. So, as far as that being a positive outcome, I don't think it could happen. And that's what Israel fears.
I guess one of the things that, we're going to go to Bob, whatever's next, but one of the things that this reminds me of, and it's another really tough conversation, thank God it's over, but it's really not, is apartheid. Because if you read Jimmy Carter's book, 20 years ago, Peace, Not Apartheid, he was roundly criticized for it. But what he was describing in Palestine was a life that is not a life. Yes, a prosperous Jewish community, prosperous Israel, and saying to the Palestinians, just give it up and accept it. Accept you don't get to vote. Accept that you can't move from your neighborhood. Accept that you can't work in certain areas. That's apartheid. And it certainly wasn't, it's not something I think we can embrace.
All of us feel naively that during the Camp David Accords, that Yasser Arafat should have signed that.
Sure.
They've been in Egypt for 2 years, and I found out very clearly, had he signed that, he was a dead man when he returned it. So that's why he didn't sign it.
Good point. That's a good point. And now, Bob?
Could you explain, I'm not so much sure what lit the fuse, because a year ago, this is what, or I we seem to be moving towards is, finally, we had peace in the Middle East. Now, all of a sudden, we're at war. What lit the fuse? I'm so much, because all these conditions still existed the last several years that I'm aware of.
Yeah. Two stories. The first, that's and it's credible to me, but again, I maybe have a bias here. And I heard it explained best by a professor in New York who is Palestinian. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is located, if you remember, right at the bottom of the area that's blocked out there, the most holy place in all of Israel for Palestinians and Muslims. Of course, Mecca is more holy. But apparently, 12 days ago, armed Israeli military, IFI people, IDF people, I can never remember what the acronym is, the military, came into the Aqsa Mosque during prayer on the last day of Ramadan. Bad time to go into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, period. And started shooting. Now, they started shooting for some reason. I think somebody must have been doing something wrong. That's what the professor from New York says lit the fuse. And I've read other accounts that say it was the action in the Al-Aqsa Mosque that lit the fuse. The other story is Hamas started sending rockets into Israel. And I believe both. I think that it's likely that there was an incident in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I think you can't give 19 and 20-year-olds guns and heavy armament anywhere in the world and expect there never to be an incident. It's going to happen. I think, therefore, I find it credible that some military forces shot in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jenny?
Okay. It's a shame that we cannot go back before 1948, when we had the Jewish people were coming to the area that was known as Palestine then, and coming back to what they figured was their homeland, and escaping from Russia, persecution and everything else. And they came, they taught the Arabs better agriculture, they worked together with them, everything was doing pretty well. And then all of a sudden, the UN decided, some people say it was the guilt of Europe for what had happened to the Jewish people during World War II, the Holocaust, that they decided, yes, we're going to give you a state, and we're going to call it Israel, which then upset the Palestinians, of course. And the next thing you know, you had the war that had to come in 1948, but in 1947, when this mandate was decided by the UN, the British left. They had been there since 1917, and they left the Israelis vulnerable. So what happened? All those Arab countries around said, aha, we're going to take over. And all of a sudden, no longer did you have the Arab farmer who was next to the Israeli farmer, no longer could they be the way they had been before, working together, making a better country, and getting along together. So we can't go back to that. Now we have a generation of Palestinians who have known nothing but this horrible existence that they have had and a hatred for what has happened to what they think is their land, Palestine. So I don't see how we're going to get to having, it would be great to have one state, but I don't see how we're going to do it. There's too much bitterness.
For me to say that's my preferred option is not, I'm not saying because it's so easy to do. It just seems to me two states aren't going to work.
No, they
They
won't.
didn't work in 1948. Let's not forget, it wasn't a land of milk and honey. I think that comes from somewhere in the Bible. In 1947. The Jews who came there first, the Zionists, who came there when the British were still in control, were fighting the British, alongside a lot of other people, saying it's time for this colonization to end. And the British finally, not just in the Middle East, but around the world, abandoned their colonial powers. And what happened around the world in those colonies, the former colonies, hasn't been a happy story, I don't think, anywhere. And I worked in most of those colonies. If you look at this map, it wasn't the Israelis, it wasn't the Jews, by the way, who governed in the yellow parts. The orange parts. And it wasn't the Palestinians who governed in the yellow parts. Each of those were managed in one form or another by the UN. And that's the country, not an independent Israel with a blue flag, that was attacked by 6 countries all around them. While Palestinians have known persecution in one form or another since 1948, the Jews have been attacked by major powers in full-out war over and over and over again. They have a right to exist, and it's a right to exist that countries around them have not acknowledged, in some cases yet today, that Hamas doesn't acknowledge today. And I completely agree with Forrest. To not focus on that and face it is just silly. And that justifies to me an Iron Dome, with $4 billion a year, which is how much we give every year. And it's more than that in most years. And support for Israel, full stop. But as much as I believe Israel has a right to exist and we have to support them, I believe Palestinians shouldn't live in the conditions they live. The answer is really elusive. Let's go first to Jeannie and then back to because you haven't had a chance to speak, back to Charles. I hope you've got a solution.
Yes, I do. Firstly, the Palestinians do have other options. They can leave those immigration camps. They can go elsewhere. They do have those options. Second of all, this right to return is an interesting concept because I don't see the native Indians having a right to return. I don't see our state of Texas, which we say declared its independence, but in fact was won by the United States by a battle. So I think we're being just a little bit hypocritical in some of these statements. And when I was in Israel, they brought out again and again and again that this area had been arid, it had been non-productive, and the Jews were the ones who produced desalinization plants. They found drought-resistant plants, and they turned it into a green land.
2 comments. First of all, looking at that map again, those orange parts were parts of Israel you didn't want to live.
Right.
And those are the parts that eventually were given to the Jews. And the Jews took those parts where you didn't want to live and made it into a real green, productive economy. I mean, that's absolutely true, and it's extremely important. The yellow parts, where Jerusalem is, and where most of the population was, were settled not because people didn't want to live there. That's where people wanted to live, and that's where the Palestinians were. The right to return and its application to Native Americans, for example, is also in courts around, because some Indians have said over and over again, we have a right to be here. That to me is settled a lot only because we don't let them talk about it. And I agree with you, it's contentious. People move, and after they've moved, particularly if they move as a result of war or violence, how do you give them a right to return? Charles?
Talk to the end. Okay. The traditional support that the United States has had for Israel since 1948, perhaps before that as well, it's not entirely just we feel sorry for Israel And therefore, we got to do something to help them exist because they've had one hell of a history. Keep in mind, Israel represents for the United States a place where democracy goes on, where all around it it's not. It is probably our strongest ally in the Middle East. And the Middle East, with all the oil and everything that they have, is viewed very hungrily by China, by Russia, and all of the people who are so-called enemies. So what we are representing there is a bulwark against that. So it's not entirely, we're being good guys. We're getting something from their existence. The United States is getting something in the way of a representative for that area of the world.
No question about it. Bob's got his hand up. But before that, I don't think I showed this, and then we'll go back to Larry. I haven't showed this slide before. This has divided politically here, and some of that political division you've heard. Democrats are beginning to question Israel and say, why are we giving so much aid to the richest ally we have? Why are we supporting this apartheid? And that's become the Democratic side. On the Republican side, it's Netanyahu all the way. Let's go to Carol first, then Larry Lee, back over here. Carol, and then we'll come back to Bob. You've had it 2 times. Carol?
Well, just like we're concerned here in America about what's being taught in public education, I think the fact that the madrasas, which are the schools that teach hate for America, and then your Hamas schools teach death to the Israelis. And when you teach young children from the time they're little those principles, I don't see how you ever would come to a solution by the time they get to the adults.
That's so sadly true. And listening to the young kids in both parts of settled Israel, each side saying death to the other. Black Lives Matter. Larry?
Gee, I hate to be this negative about it, but let's go back to the Barbary Coast. And that's how far back in history where a lot of this began. And the pirates of the Barbary Coast were interfering with American merchant ships. And we were just a very young country with not a lot organized yet. And because of that, we formed a navy to protect those merchants. And that settled that problem. And then we began to send in missionaries to try and enforce our thoughts on religion. In other words, we have been involved in trying to carry on and solve problems in that part of the world. And what is that saying? There will always be wars and rumors of wars. And I know that great financial support is being poured into Israel from this country. And then it sort of swings back and forth between the political parties here, as it did between Obama and Trump. As I said, I hate to be negative, but we can keep on messing around over there, and I think it's still going to be forever a problem.
Sadly, I think you're right. And the good news is Carol has the answer.
I don't think there is an answer, frankly. But I'm so surprised that nobody has mentioned the political situation in Israel, because Netanyahu is one of the people, first of all, he can't form a cabinet. And this apparently was to his great advantage, because they were about to form a cabinet with a Palestinian Israeli, and Bennett, who was his opposition. And because of this, that formation has dissolved. But Netanyahu is one of the people who is so influential in getting the Jews into the West Bank. He's a great believer in that, and I think he's been completely wrong. And that's caused a great deal of controversy altogether.
Yeah, it's interesting. Ken?
Well, I sure don't have an answer to this, but I think the status quo has to be changed. Who the hell knows how? But you know, we haven't mentioned the Abraham Accords. Various countries have now supported the right of Israel to exist. This is all rather recent. And the only country that's really gaining anything by all of this is Iran. And yet we continue to deal with them because of their threat of the nuclear bomb. But all the rockets that Hamas just issued came from Iran. So they're the focus of the whole problem. But again, how the Palestinian problem, you know, when I visited, you have kids, I don't know what they do. I didn't see any ball fields, or I think they do play soccer, but when you're a teenager there, it's terrible.
Particularly in the occupied territories, 43% unemployment is.
Well, I wasn't in Gaza.
But you're in West Bank, and you're in Bethlehem.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Bethlehem.
Politics, religion, human nature. I think the whole world needs sessions with good psychiatrists, because inside all of us, it can be a huge temper tantrum at the drop of a hat, right? And we're just human. And in these parts of the world, it is tragic to watch. When we were in Israel, there was a church, an important church, with a dome that was falling apart, falling completely apart, or a steeple, I've forgotten. But do you remember the church, Bob?
Oh, yeah.
But anyways, falling completely apart, and we asked our Israeli God, what's going on here? And he said, well, these are the Christian, you know, all the
5 different Christian groups.
5 different Christian religions were responsible for this church, and they could not agree on how to repair or when to repair the steeple. I mean, to me, that says it all about human nature. I don't know that we'll ever get together. It goes back to our talks here about tribalism. I mean, we are inherently human, I suppose, and therefore vulnerable to weakness and vulnerable to hate.
We're still going to talk about how to improve it, Bob.
The map that you had up of the split between the Arabs and the
At the beginning?
Israelis.
The yellow and the orange.
Yeah, right there, right there. No, that's not right.
The yellow and orange. There.
There you go. That was the Balfour Agreement.
Yeah. Balfour was 1904.
And the Americans, and Truman was the president at the time. He took charge and made, he insisted, and we just won a war, and insisted that the boundaries that are today change. And you can see why the Americans and the Israelis would not accept this, because what the Arabs wanted were those little tiny pathways from one of the major places to the other. And I don't know who would agree with that if they were Palestinians at that time. I'm sorry, Israelis at that time, because that's a choke point. And wouldn't happen at all. And that's why Truman settled the whole thing by just declaring that whatever he said was going to be the way it was. He won. And just a little tiny thing on the Barbary Coast. The Barbary Coast is important because somehow Jefferson had to find a way for our cargo going back and forth would be safe. And the Arabs were confiscating everything. And as a result, Jefferson built a navy and went over, crushed them, and solved that problem, at least for the time, and for a long time. So that's the Barbary Coast. For the rest of the Barbary Coast.
Listen, I'm sorry that we're kind of running out of time. I want to wrap up with a comment that first back to Ted.
The only reason that we're talking here about this whole thing is oil. That's the only way that we got involved in the Middle East. Otherwise, we would have done the same thing that Biden's doing, electrify everything.
That's an interesting comment. I think I'd add one other thing. Certainly oil has run the world for a long time. I think that the Holocaust caused all of the world, especially the United States, to pay attention to Israel. We all felt a real duty, an obligation to do something about that catastrophe. And the Zionists had an answer. And I think the support for Israel exists independent of oil, independent of any financial advantages to the United States. Personally, I think that was a motivation for a lot of what has happened all these years. It's now a few minutes after 11, so we have to stop. I'll sum up by saying this. The purpose of current events is to raise issues to a level where we understand them better. We can watch the news and read the paper and have some background on the issues. I'd like to think that a World of Current Events group in some part of Florida with, 40 people who are really concerned about the issue would come up with a solution. And we've got it here on video. We'll send that out to Washington and say, do this. I doubt we're going to do that. But think about these issues as you watch the news. I'd love to talk about this again sometime. Other issues will crowd it out. It's the nature of current events. The things that aren't going to change, sadly, are the lives of those people in those refugee camps. I agree with what Jeannie said. They're free to go. They don't go. They nurture their hatred, their resentment. They are descendants of refugees, and it's their grandchildren who are walking through the streets saying, kill the other. Think about that one. Thank you all. Oops, Forrest.
Why don't you close with as you label it, sad truths? Because that's
Yeah, I think that's something quite interesting that I didn't talk about before. There are a couple of winners of this thing. Netanyahu was on his way out. I think Jeannie said that, or Carol Lee. Literally days away from the next Knesset being formed, and he was no longer going to be prime minister, and he was going to probably go to jail. That's a pretty high motivation. One could say, who's behind the shooting at the Al-Aqsa Mosque? Bibi's son. That's not true, and you all know it. The other winner is Hamas. Hamas has been just a disastrous failure in Gaza. They have not delivered government. And they were close to, I think, there might have been a change where, maybe a revived PA, Palestinian Authority up in West Bank, get Mahmoud Abbas out, get a younger generation in, would take over in Gaza. Not now. Now Hamas is, because of this shooting, the winner. And all the issues, whether it's poverty or right of return, occupied military zones, remain. Nothing was solved by these 11 days. Thank you. No meeting next week. And somebody help.